Milton Bradley had a game one time, it was a while back, that was called Mall Madness. Anybody remember that? Barely? Okay, yeah, one, very good. It's kind of like Monopoly, a board game like Monopoly was, but the description went like this. Will you be the first to lose all your money? You are let loose in a shopping mall with $200, so you know it was a while back. Go to it and spend it all. Empty your pockets first and you'll win the game. And when you spend every last cent, your marker will move triumphantly into the winner's circle, labeled broke, and you will win. You know, I was rereading that the other day, and I thought, just objectively, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, that can't be the goal of life. That can't be the goal of anything, really. But the reality is that I think we live in a world where contentment is kind of an elusive thing. We're trying to acquire that contentment by buying things or by doing things or just getting out there and trying to do something that adds something to your life is what most people kind of make a life doing. Objectively, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we can't ever seem to fill that thing that's been the issue. Came across this recent survey, though. It says that female teenagers discovered that, or a survey of female teenagers discovered that 93% of female teenagers said that the number one favorite pastime in all the world was what? Shopping. It actually beat out dating by 20% for the first spot, which I thought was interesting too. And I share all that just to say this. We're finishing up the last in the series on the Ten Commandments, and we've taken a look at each and every one of them so far. And my prayer as we've gone through this is that they've challenged you to look at these commandments a little bit differently. That as we've gone through, you've seen that they're not quite as easy to keep, that we kind of blow it all the time in all these different areas, which is to keep us repentant before the Lord so that we receive that forgiveness continually in our life. Today, I don't think it's any different. I was talking to somebody today, and they were saying, it's no fair you finally getting to the one I struggle with, so this whole area of contentment and comparisons, and you name it. Anyway, this whole commandment just says this, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. And with the holidays coming up on the horizon, before we spend all that money, I thought there's no time better to talk about this than right now. So let's start with this. What is coveting? I actually looked it up in the dictionary, and it read this way. To covet, the uncontrolled desire to acquire. They actually make apps now, I think most apps now, with an ability to purchase stuff. And so they intentionally make the game so that it either stalls out or you can't quite do certain things unless you purchase something to do it quicker. And it's genius. And instead of selling a game for $30, they'll make $300. They'll make $3,000 on some of these people because they just have this insatiable ability to say no, or this inability to say no. And they just keep purchasing more and more and more and more until they spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars on a dumb game. Nobody in their right mind would spend $3,000 for a video game on the front end. But because of this inability to say no, because of this desire to move forward, they keep spending money, dollar after dollar after dollar. It's an interesting thing. God made us with this desire to acquire. Just as an example of that, he made little squirrels with a desire to acquire nuts, right? So they store up for the winter. He made birds with a desire to acquire hay and stuff like that so they can build nests. And he made humans too with a desire. He's filled this world with all kinds of exciting and wonderful and good, desirable things. And he gives us this desire to acquire. In and of itself, that is not a bad thing. Coveting is this uncontrolled inability, right, or this uncontrolled desire to keep acquiring more. So I moved into a subdivision in Fort Worth, Texas. When I first moved there as a pastor, we built a new home. I was super excited about that. It was, about 1,800 square feet or whatever. It was my first home. It was super exciting. And we drove in, and I had my Saturn. It was my second Saturn. It was awesome. It had air conditioning, unlike my first car. It had automatic locks and windows, unlike my first car. I mean, it was awesome. I was so excited about it. And we moved in, and my neighbor was driving a Honda. My other neighbor was driving a Hyundai, and it was great. Everything fit. A couple years into it, though, they started building bigger homes in the back of our subdivision, and I started noticing, Beamers and Mercedes and Hummers and stuff like that driving into the houses and back. And then all of a sudden, I started noticing that my neighbor upgraded his Honda to a BMW, and my other neighbor upgraded his Hyundai to a Mercedes. And all of a sudden, I started to look at my Saturn, which was awesome, by the way. Everything still worked. I hadn't been in an accident. Nothing bad had happened. I started looking at my Saturn as if it was somehow less than. Why did that happen? Because I started looking over here, and all of a sudden what they had seemed to somehow make what I had different. See, God, as he walks us through this commandment, is trying to keep that from happening in our life. He's trying to give us this thing called contentment, being good where we are. Not that he doesn't bless us in times to be able to go do this or that, but just to rejoice in where you are and not be always looking for the next thing. Because the more and more we start to covet, the more and more we experience fatigue in our life, the more we experience debt in our life as we purchase things that we cannot afford, the more it causes worry because of all the stuff that we purchase, the more it creates conflict sometimes with other people, especially if you're coveting their spouse or something like that. And as the sum result, it just creates a lot of dissatisfaction in our lives. So this morning I want to begin by having you ask yourself a question. And I want you to answer it honestly. I'm just going to ask it of you guys. I want you to ask the question, am I a content person? Okay, I want you to think HGTV. How do you do watching those shows? How do you do with the different, driving through Paradise Valley or looking at different houses? Am I a content person? And then if you came with somebody that knows you, I want you to look at them and ask the question, do you think I'm a content person? And I just want them to go like this or like this, right? And I share that because I think sometimes feedback is helpful in this area. Because sometimes the truth is painful. So just go like this or go like this. You don't need to add any rhetoric. Does anybody remember the song, You Can't Get No Satisfaction? I love that song. I love that song. And as you go through the words of that song, it's just interesting that 50 years later, you're still hearing those common complaints, right? I meet people all the time that are unhappy and unfulfilled and unsatisfied with their life. I was just talking to a guy the other day that hates his job, and I hurt for him. I don't know why he hates his job. I think jobs are mainly neutral. I love my job 99% of the time, right? But the reality is, I think mostly jobs are neutral. I was on a paint crew for a lot of summers growing up, and that isn't my favorite job in the world. I'm not that good at it, but the reality is I had a ball doing that because of the people. I think it's the people so often that make or break jobs. And I think you can challenge yourself in different jobs just by the very nature of the job itself. And so I just don't get it when people hate their jobs. And so I lamented for that. But he lives with an incredible amount of dissatisfaction in his life because he wants to be doing this, or he wants to be doing that, or he wants his life to look like this, or he wants it to be like that. And he can't ever just be content with where he is. And it's causing him to live with misery instead of joy. It's an interesting thing. We're still living with these common complaints, and yet our culture continues to push this narrative that he who dies with the most toys wins. But all that's done for so many people is create a lifelong season of discontent. I mean, think about it. You watch TV and you see all the things that you cannot have, and your level of discontent rises proportionately. In fact, if you were to believe all the things that you see on TV, on the commercials today, you would believe that contentment was actually something that could be sprayed on, rolled, inhaled, eaten, or even driven. As if somehow these things that we purchase have this magical quality to make us happy and content with life. And I think they do for a season. I mean, Christmas morning is awesome, isn't it? You're like, wow, this is so cool. I got this new shirt or I got this whatever, and I'm super excited about it. But how many of you guys are still excited about this a year later or 10 months later? It wanes. It goes away, and then we're on to the next big thing to make us happy. God says, I just want you to be happy all the time. I want you to experience joy all the time, peace all the time, and not get so caught up in this other stuff. I do this. I share this command because I love you, because I want you to enjoy life, truly enjoy life. And so in Philippians 4:11 and 12, Paul begins to speak to this very issue to us. And he says this, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty, but I have learned the secret of being content in any and every circumstance. I love that verse, I think, because it's challenging. Because I don't know a lot of people that are content in every situation in my life. I don't know if I know any. But as you listen to that, I do think it raises the question again for us, what exactly is contentment again, right? Because as you listen to Paul is saying this, that contentment is something that is independent of our circumstances. So it's not dependent on anybody's mood, or it's not dependent on what kind of car your neighbor's driving. It's not dependent on the neighborhood that you're in. It's not dependent on anything except for what's going on inside of here. That you do not base your happiness on the situation around you, Paul says, but on what's inside of you. It's where you grasp hold of the reality that happiness is something that comes from within. And I think that's a powerful statement and one that I think we struggle with, especially because we're bombarded in this materialistic culture that we live in all the time with just ad after ad after ad that says, you need this, you need this, you need this in order to be happy. And it's weird that this is coming in the midst of a time that the division between the have and the have-nots has gotten wider and wider and wider over time. So fewer and fewer people can enjoy some of this stuff that just seems to be on the horizon. And this, Paul says, this whole idea of learning contentment is something that can be learned, which is a wonderful thing. Someone once said that life is a school of contentment, which I think is pretty insightful. But the problem is that so many people, too many people, go their whole life not learning a thing, and then they die at the end unfulfilled and unsatisfied and unhappy. So Paul this morning tries to give us 4 things. 4 keys, 4 lessons, if you will, that can, if we would assimilate them into our life, could give us the tools we need to build contentment into our life. How many of you guys want peace in the midst of a storm, right? Joy in the midst of adversity, right? Hope when everything's falling apart. These are the good things that God gives us if we'll just trust him in his ways. And so he calls us to do that. And so if you struggle with contentment, if you struggle with envy, if you struggle with all this stuff that we're going to be talking about today, I invite you to write these things down and really, truly commit to working on them, because these can give you a freedom to live life just differently than you have before. So let me start with one of the most obvious ones. The first thing that we need to do, and then the first 2 are about what we can do, is we need to learn to avoid comparisons. Why? Because comparing yourself to others always leads to discontentment. In verse 11, Paul writes, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstance. But that can only happen if you're not comparing yourself to somebody else. I refer you to my Saturn, my awesome Saturn that somehow was less than because my neighbors bought different cars. How did that change my reality? It didn't change my reality at all, except it changed my mind. And that started to affect my emotions, which messed me up. Paul's just saying if you want to learn to be content, you have to learn to avoid comparisons. That's the starting place, because the reality of life is that there will always be people out there that make more money than you, that have more than you, that have greater opportunities than you, or that have fewer problems than you. You ever get envious of people that just seem to struggle with life a little bit less? But let me ask you this. As you think about this, I want you to ask yourself this question. So what? What does what somebody's driving next door have to do with your car or your experience in life? What is what your sibling does for a living? How does that affect you and your job? How does any of the stuff on the external side affect you? It's hard, right? You watch HGTV and you see this kitchen redone, or your best friend redoes their kitchen, and it's amazing and it's awesome, and you look at your kitchen and you're like, oh, but how does that affect it? It doesn't. We let these external things mess with our thinking way too much. And then it starts messing with our emotions, and that's where we start to get into trouble. The reality is that it has no bearing at all, most of this external stuff, on our personal happiness. And so Paul continues, we don't look around at what we see now, all the troubles around us, but we look forward to the joys in heaven. The troubles will soon be over, and the joys that come will last forever. 2 Corinthians 4:18, Paul's just saying this. I don't look around anymore. I look up. I don't spend my time comparing myself to other people anymore. But I keep my eyes on what God's going to be doing. You see, Paul, somewhere along the line, right, he learned to live for heaven. I mean, that's why he was willing to do all the stuff that he did. That's why he was willing to be persecuted. That's why he was willing to go into towns knowing he was going to be persecuted. That's why he went through life, this last portion of his life, ministering about Jesus Christ and the hope and the peace and the comfort and the forgiveness he gives, because he knew it was a better way, and he knew he was storing up treasures for his eternity. It wasn't about what he had now, it's what he would have in the future. And it gave him a perspective to live life differently, to enjoy the different times that he was in, or to at least make the best of it. So again, avoid comparisons. And I share this because I think there's so many misconceptions out there that the world, or at least marketing in our world, seems to keep on encouraging, that just distorts our thinking on this. One of the first ones is this: I must have what other people have in order to be happy. Right? You get the new Apple phone that comes out, or the new phone, the latest edition of whatever, and I can't live unless I have that. Or the new computer game that comes out. I can't live unless I have that. I have the old version, last year's version. It doesn't even work as cool as this one. We've got to learn to be content with what we have, because if you're always waiting for something else to make you happy, then it will always be short-term and you'll never find that lasting happiness. Many people spend so much time trying to win the approval of others. That's the next one. Next lie is this: I must be liked by everyone in order to be happy. Sometimes this is subtle, sometimes it's just overt in life, but I know people that if somebody doesn't like them, it torments them. And they'll do anything they can to try to schmooze up to them and try to change their perspective and try to win them over. And it's almost like it becomes a quest until they can do it. But they're miserable until somehow they win the affirmation of somebody they might not even like. The truth is, though, you can't go through life with everybody's approval all the time. Whatever you do, if you do anything, you're bound to find that somebody's going to disapprove of what you've just done. It's just the reality of life. If your kids always approve of what you do, you're probably doing it wrong. Does that make sense? And your spouse probably isn't approving of what you're doing. The reality is, as you go through this, I guarantee you there's somebody out there that doesn't like what you're doing. Think about it. Even Jesus couldn't please everybody, and he was perfect. He always did the right thing. He always did the thing that built up other people. He was always kind. He was always loving. He always did the thing that was the right thing, and people still disapproved of his actions. And so Paul says again, I don't look around, I look up. You don't need everybody's approval to be happy. You just need God's approval. Ultimately, if you and God are on the same page, if God is approving of what you're doing because you're trying to follow him, then you got to live with the hits of everybody else. You just got to live with them. Just to honor the fact that people have different opinions. They have differences in the way they look at life. They just have different ideas about what's right and what's wrong. But if you are on the same page with God, just honor that you are storing up treasures in heaven and that God loves you and that you're okay with him. And let that give you the strength to move forward. Another one. Having more will make me more happy. Except we all actually sort of believe that, right? You guys make enough money as it is, or do you want a little bit more in your paycheck? Well, I want a little bit more. You guys have enough in retirement right now, or do you want a little bit more in retirement? It seems like, is 2 cookies enough, or do you want a little bit more? I mean, it seems like all through life we want a little bit more. That's what would make us more happy, for sure. Howard Hughes was once asked this: how much money does it take to make a man happy? What did he say? Just a little bit more. I mean, that's the whole idea. But you've got the little bit more over time, haven't you? I mean, you got the higher wage, or you got the extra cookie, or whatever it might be. But as your income goes up, so did your expenses. And now you're still back to the same place. And what do you want? A little bit more. How many of you have arrived when it comes to income? You don't have to raise your hand, but hopefully all of us could say that no matter what we make. I can't believe what God's blessed me with in this life. I can't believe the place that I'm in. I love my family. I love my house. I love my cars. We should all be saying the same thing. We love the blessings that God has given us. We should live in thanksgiving all the time. So why don't we? The struggle with contentment. The struggle with envy. 1 Timothy 6 and 8, it says, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Food and clothing, and be content with that. Yeah, but my buddies are going on this trip to wherever, or my other friends, they keep doing these cool activities outside the home, or they just redid the kitchen. Food and clothing, and I will be content with that. He's just saying that possessions are temporary. They're just loaned out to us for a period of time. While we're here on earth, we can have a good time with them. We can enjoy them. We can celebrate them, celebrate God and his glory for blessing us with them in this life. But they're ultimately not going to last. We don't get to take a single thing with us to heaven. Naked I came into this world, and what does Scripture say? And naked shall I depart. We don't even get to take our clothes, not even the ones buried in the casket with us, not even those. I was talking to somebody the other day. And they're getting older, so they're older than me, so they're past 53, right? So super old. But the reality is, they're looking at some of the stuff that they've acquired over time. And he said, I came to some interesting conclusions. Number one, I think my stuff's cooler than any of my kids do, right? I mean, they just don't seem to have the same value that I place on it. And secondly, I don't know why I've acquired all this stuff. We don't need it. I haven't looked at some of this stuff for years. There's stuff in my drawer I haven't seen in 20 years, he said. I don't know what it's still doing in my house. I've had this realization, he says, that I'm going to go to heaven and I'm just going to leave all this stuff behind, and they're probably going to have a big yard sale and sell hundreds of thousands of dollars for 50 cents. They just don't care. So he said, I think I'm going to start giving some of it away. If I can find the right person for the right thing and I can bless them with it, then I can have the joy of being part of that. And he says, pray for me on this because I need to find the right person for the right thing because I know they don't all think this stuff's cool. So help me do that because I want to bless people while I'm living. That's why God has blessed me so I can bless other people. So just kind of a side tangent. So Beth and I, a while back, decided that we don't want to do yard sales anymore. We just don't want to do them. We'd rather give stuff away to people to bless them. Plus, I hate yard sales, so that was the other part that went into it. But I love the idea of this because God has blessed us for a season to use the couch or to use whatever, the table or whatever these things are in our life, and now we can give them free of charge to other people to be blessed by. Any parent who's had little kids has experienced this, right? Because somebody gave them clothes for their kids somewhere in their family or a friend or church or somebody, they got some clothes for their kids so that they could pass it on to somebody else, that they, the ones that they didn't destroy. And you've been blessed by that. So we've just kind of gotten into this habit of doing that, and I love the freedom of that, and I love not having to do the yard sale, but I love being able to bless those people, other people with the things that God has given us, that it's not always about the money so that we can go get the next thing, but it's about being a blessing to other people. All right, he goes on and he gives us another one. It's not just comparisons. He also says, guys, we got to learn to adjust to change. Why? Because life is filled with ups and downs, isn't it? Emotionally, physically, mentally, financially. We've seen this in spades over the last couple of years. There's nothing certain in life except for change. And if that's true, you need to ask yourself, how do I do a change? How do I handle it when things are shaken up a little bit? Our whole world has been shaken up a little bit. How are we doing with it? I feel like most people, you're not doing well. And so ask yourself, do I get frightened? Do I get moody, angry, uptight? Paul is just saying this, that one of the secrets to learning contentment in life is having this ability to adjust to the different circumstances that life presents us. See, Paul says that we need to learn to adjust to it because your happiness in life is largely dependent upon your ability to adapt, to adjust, and to be flexible in life. If you can't do that, you're going to be bitter and angry old people, right? And I don't want you to be that. How many of you guys are getting older? Anybody? Okay, me too. How many of you guys have noticed over time that your body doesn't quite work the same way anymore? Yeah, isn't that crazy? I played kickball the other day, and I'm still sore. That was 3 weeks ago. I don't know how that works. All right, so you can either fight against and resist getting older, and you can lament every new thing that's hard or difficult or whatever, or you can embrace the new seasons. Not that you enjoy that your body doesn't work the same, but just enjoy the new seasons, trying to make the best of the new seasons that you find yourself in. But isn't that a parallel to anything in life? You get a new boss at work. You can either lament that the boss isn't like the old guy or that he does things differently or whatever, or you can try to adjust and make the best of it. Why? So that you can have peace at work, or you can have peace in your life, or you can have joy moving forward, that it isn't all about these external things, but it's about what's going on in here. We need to learn to adjust to change. In verse 12, it says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. In other words, he's been in both spots. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. Paul was just saying, I've seen the good times and I've seen the bad times. Perspective. When he's writing this, he's old, he's lonely, he's cold in a Roman prison. And it's not like our prisons today. They didn't have TVs and they didn't have toilets in the room. The toilet was in the dirt next to you, I guess, or the hole that you dug. It was miserable. It was cold. They didn't have central heating. They didn't have central cooling. They went out of their way to make your life miserable. It was brutal being in a Roman prison. He was away from his friends, and so he was lonely. And yet, as you read through his writings, as he's writing these different letters from prison, he's just saying, I can handle this. It's not a problem. You don't need to feel bad for me. God's doing amazing things. I can cope. I'm flexible. Listen to his perspective as he's writing through these. God's given me this amazing mission field. It's awesome. It's amazing. I'm reaching so many people for Jesus. He's being chained to a Roman guard 24/7. He has no privacy whatsoever. They beat him up. They do all sorts of things. And he's rejoicing at the mission field that's before him. Do you see? Just a little difference in your perspective can change misery to joy and excitement about what God's doing. They can change these just brutal things to challenges. It changes everything if you can change what's going on in here and what's going on in here. Again, the external world doesn't have to affect you. Guy who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Anyway, Steve Covey. He wrote in his book, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. But isn't that a profound thing? I know people that had one thing happen to them in their life, a brutal thing, and they let it define the rest of their life. They were unable to move forward, unable to get healthy, unable to do constructive things because they pressed pause in their life and they said, I'm going to stay in this misery for forever, or I'm going to let this thing dictate the decisions I make moving forward. I'm not going to make good decisions anymore. I'm going to make bad decisions because I'm mad at God or whatever the deal might be. But I've watched people press pause for years. They lose a kid. That's traumatic. That's horrible. But God didn't tell you to stop living. He said, trust him. Let him heal that brokenness. Let him get you to the other side so that you can continue living and accomplish the purposes that he's had for you. You go through a divorce. That's brutal. But God didn't tell you to stop living or to excuse sin or to excuse whatever. He says, let him heal you. Let him dust you off. Let him fill that void. Let him get you to the other side of it. God is a God that is possible, right? He makes things possible. He is a God of healing. He is a God of restoration. We need to run to him in the hard things of life, not press pause and stay in them. But way too often we press the pause. Way too often we play the victim. And it's a powerful word for me. In raising my girls, I just said, don't be a victim. You call one of my girls a victim, and that's fighting words in our house. They don't like that. Why? Because I don't want them to be a victim. Again, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. Don't let somebody's mood victimize you or excuse why you have to act sad now. Don't let somebody's behavior victimize you. Don't let somebody's decision victimize you. No matter what hurt, experience, or difficulty I go through, Paul writes, and he has every reason to have bad memories. He's been stoned almost to death twice. He was shipwrecked. He was persecuted. He was slandered in almost every town that he went to. He says, I will not let it victimize me. That doesn't need to define me. God defines me. And he looked for his source of, peace, centeredness, comfort from God and not to all the people that were around him. I am independent of my circumstances, Paul would write. And that's freedom, isn't it? If your wife or your husband can have a mood, but you don't let it affect you, you're like, well, you do you, right? I'm having a good day, and you just don't let it manipulate you or affect you. Your boss makes a decision that makes your life harder. You can lament that. That's okay. So you work through it, but you don't let it make you miserable about your job. Again, God calls us not to be victims, but to be proactive, to trust in him to get us to the other sides of different things. All right, let me go to the next one. As we're doing this, we need to also learn to draw on Christ's power. So instead of depending on our own efforts, which clearly is not enough to make it through circumstances, or our own energy that runs out, we need to learn to draw on Christ's power more and more. In verse 13, Paul writes this powerful thing. He says, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. In other words, I can handle it when the kids are tearing the place apart. I can handle it when there's runaway inflation in our economy. I can handle it when I have problems that I don't know where to go. Why? Because I have a God who can handle anything. I can't handle everything, Paul says. I can cope. He has this external power source that's coming into his life that's giving him the strength to keep taking those steps forward. He's not playing victim. He's just going forward in God's strength. He was depending not on his own power because that would run out long ago, but on God's power. But do you know when you're depending on your own power, you get tired. You get fatigued. Fatigue comes from living life on your own resources rather than in God's resources. Jerusalem Bible says there's nothing I cannot master with the help of the one who gives me strength. I've shared this before, but sometimes I'm a control enthusiast, right? And so I worry because that's my attempt to try to control the uncontrollable. It doesn't make any sense. It's insanity, actually. So I've really worked hard to get rid of that. And when I realize that I'm doing it now, I can give it to God. It's the darndest thing, but when I give it to God, I can go to sleep. I can stop my mind. I can stop worrying, and I have this tangible peace that replaces it. I have to remember to do it. But God has, I guess, given me the trust in him to just give it to him and trust that he's got it. And when I do that, I can experience peace. Wouldn't it be cool if we could live every area of our life like that? Issue at work, God, I give it to you, and then you have peace. And with that peace, contentment, and joy, and you can live life, and it doesn't mess with your relationships anymore. It doesn't mess with your spouses. I mean, coming home grumpy or acting dumb or whatever. It doesn't hurt your kids. It doesn't mess with your friends. I give it to God, and I'm at peace. Most of us we strive more and more in life trying to find this peace. And the more we trust God, the more we find this peace in our life. And God's just calling us to do that. More and more, I've got you. I'm with you. Let me give you the strength. Let me work things behind the scenes for your good. Trust me in this, he calls us. Paul says, I can master anything then with the help of Christ who gives me strength. And I tell you, I've quoted this verse thousands of times in my life, and I've needed to thousands of times, maybe more than that. And when I remember and give it to him, God can give me that tangible gift of saying, I got it. Relax. I'm in control. I experienced that you're 6 years old and you're running to mom and dad's room because you had the nightmare, and all of a sudden there's peace. In those moments, and I wish I could live my life in those moments, but I experienced that same kind of gift. In fact, the text even says that God infuses inner strength in me. In other words, when I plunge into his power, then I really come alive, or I find that peace, or I find that joy. When Paul had a problem in our text, and he actually prayed about something 3 times. He called it a thorn in his flesh. 3 times, God, take this away. Take this thorn in the flesh away. Do any of you guys have thorns in the flesh? It could be relationships, it could be financial, it could be physical. And you prayed over and over, God, take this away. If you are, then you know where Paul is. And you know if you've read through the scripture that God didn't take it away, but Paul writes this. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. He's just saying this thorn, when whatever I'm using it right now to draw you to me. I'm using it right now to strengthen your trust in me. I'm using it right now to continue to remind you that I've got you as you walk through this life. Trust me and let me continue to give you the strength to keep taking those steps forward. Sufficient is the same word as contentment in Philippians. Sufficiency and contentment. Contentment is independent of our circumstances. That's what Paul writes. So there's so often where God allows us to go through adversity or problems in our life to teach us this contentment, this trust, this sufficiency, this trust, so that he can build that more into our life and so that we can see him work more in our life, reminding us that he's got us. And then he goes to his last piece. We need to learn to trust then that God will meet our needs. This is the secret to satisfaction in life. In fact, if I didn't trust that God would take away my problems, right, I wouldn't have that peace. You've got to trust him in this. In verse 19, he writes, and my God will meet all your needs according to his glorious riches in Jesus Christ. Not some or most or just the religious ones, it says, but all. So think about it. When you buy an insurance policy, at least when I do, I read through the insurance policy to see what's covered. And once I know what's covered, I don't worry about those things anymore. So the Bible, if you will, is kind of God's insurance policy to us. When you read through it, there's actually 6,000 plus promises in the Bible. And when you read through it and pour into those words, you begin to realize all the different promises that God's made to you. And the more you realize what he's promised, the more claims you can make with God, because you know he's true to his promises. And that will give you peace. But the problem is that so many of us can't claim any of them because we don't know what's in there. There's so much biblical illiteracy today. And yet as you read through the policy manual and you begin to find out what God has guaranteed, all of a sudden you can trust him in that. It's guaranteed to happen now in your life. And once you have those guarantees, you don't have to worry about them anymore. I share all this because I think the real reason that people are unhappy and unsatisfied and unfulfilled today is because they don't have Jesus Christ in the center of their life. I keep sharing about my buddy Mike. And Mike, he searches for everything to fill that void in his heart. Everything to fill that void. And nothing seems to fill it for very long. And yet he keeps searches out there. I keep telling him, no, it's God who fills it. Nope, he's not going to listen to me. He keeps looking for something else. They're looking for fulfillment today in all the wrong places. They run from this to that, looking for something that's going to satisfy them finally, from relationship to relationship, from job to job, from hobby to sports to recreation, from this cause to that cause, from fads to therapies to books to seminars. They're all looking for that thing that satisfies. But God's laid it out super clearly in his word. You were made with a God-shaped vacuum in your life, and only God can fill it. Somebody asked me about my testimony the other day, and part of that testimony is I was a freshman in college, and I was going to USC, so I was in Watts in Southern California, and I didn't have a car, so I wasn't wise just to go into the area. There was a Catholic church near us, but I went a couple times, and it just didn't, I don't know. I was a freshman. No excuse, but I didn't go to church much my freshman year. But one of the things that I realized as I was going through is that something was wrong. Something was missing. And I had a tangible feeling that something was wrong and something was missing, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was because I was missing my friends from high school. I didn't know, I don't know what it was. If I was missing my folks, who knows? But I came back for that summer after my freshman year, and I was sitting in church with my family on Sunday morning. And all of a sudden, I realized that what I had been missing was God. That he was the thing that I was missing. And I decided that even though I couldn't discern it, I didn't know what was causing it, I didn't know how to fix it, I was sitting in that service, and all of a sudden, God just shouted out, "You're missing me, you dunce," And so convicted by that was I that I said, well, I need to get to know this God that I profess to worship then. And I spent that sophomore year reading through the Bible, and I never stopped. I just kept reading through the Bible, and I'm sure that's part of why I'm a pastor today. But the reality is, we talk about this void. We talk about this searching to find peace or to find centeredness or to find that thing that's wrong and fix it. The answer has always been God. He's the one that can fix that stuff on the inside. So when you try to find satisfaction in life through people or fads or popularity or prestige, you're going to find over and over again that they don't last. Discontentment just means that Jesus Christ is not the center of your life at that moment. When I'm not contented, it just means I'm looking constantly for that something else to fulfill that need. But God in his scripture says he wants us to have a happy, fulfilling, and satisfying life. He actually says that. I've come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. Life in the fullest. That's what God wants you to have. That's not his main goal. He wants you in heaven is his main goal, but you're his kids, and how many of you don't want that for your kids? All of us, right? Contentment then does not mean that you like the situation that you're in at the moment. You don't hear Paul saying, man, I love prison. It's awesome. The food's amazing. People are great. No, he doesn't say any of that. He's just saying, God's got me. I don't care so much about the situation that I'm in. God's going to use it. Right now, he's using it for a mission field. And I don't care how hard it gets. God will give me the strength to sustain myself through this adversity, through this hardship. And so I'm going to keep looking to God to give me strength. Keep on looking to God to give me that strength for that next step. And so I'm going to have joy. And I'm going to choose to have joy because I'm trusting in God. I'm going to have joy in the midst of this hardship. I'm going to have peace in the midst of my chaos. And I'm going to experience forgiveness, tangible forgiveness, in the midst of suffering through the consequences of my sin. Think through that a little bit. And I share that because if you have to have a perfect life or a perfect relationship to be happy, you're never going to be happy for very long. And you're going to keep on searching and searching and searching. Paul says you got to learn to be happy in spite of your problems. That's contentment. Paul says that we can master anything through Christ's power in us, which just means we got to stop depending on us all the time, trying to figure it all the time and give it to God. And instead, he says we need to start focusing on the one that can actually help. So I'll give you this. When you see what you're doing, when you realize the discontent, when you realize the worry, when you realize the anxiety, stop trying to play ruler of the universe. And at those times, give them to God. Let him take them from you. And let him replace it with peace that comes from trusting that God's got you. Peace that comes from knowing that he's working behind the scenes for your good. Peace that knows that he loves you more than you can comprehend because you're his child. He's adopted you into his family. He wants you in heaven. Peace that comes from trusting the promises of God. And if he can rip out this discontent in your life, you're going to enjoy life so much more because you'll finally get to experience some of the good stuff. The peace and the joy and the strength and the hope that God gives. So go with that encouragement today. And all God's people said, amen. Guys, we love you. God, we love you so much. And we pray today as we've kind of finished up this 10 Commandments series I pray that as we've gone through, you've challenged us in different things, that you've challenged us in our walk with you, that you've challenged us in some of the bad habits that we have, or some of the things that we're doing that are clearly against your will, against your truth, against your will for us in our life. Things that are complicating our lives, and we can see that they're complicating in our lives because there's sin. There's always negative consequences of sin. That you would reap in us or build into us a holy guilt, I guess, if you will, because of our rebellion against you, because of the mess that it's made of our life. But then that you'd only let us stay in that guilt for 30 seconds, Lord, and you'd remind us that we are forgiven. Forgiven, so you're not going to bring it up when we get to heaven. Forgiven, so that you're never going to bring it up again. Forgiven, so that you've chosen to forget it, so that we're perfect in your sight, so that we have permission now to let it go. Forgiven. Let us experience the forgiveness of Jesus in a way that celebrates what you've done, in a way that gives us freedom from the past, in a way that gives us strength to live our lives more and more the way you've called us to do. And that's my prayer today. I pray it in the name of Jesus, and all God's people said, amen.